Hello, I'm Bishop Joe, and welcome to this third in our series of reflections on invitations to dinner with Jesus from St. Luke's Gospel. Today, we're reading from chapter 9, and one of the best loved and best known stories in the Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000. If you want to read along, we're beginning to read at verse 10. On their return, the apostles told Jesus all that they had done. Then, taking them along, he slipped quietly into a city called Bethsaida. When the crowds found out about it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed to be cured. The day was drawing to a close, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away, so that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions. For we are here in a deserted place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and had them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. And what was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So, this is a story with 3 characters, so to speak: the crowds, the disciples, and Jesus. And it seems to me that a really interesting way to read this story is to ask, who is the story really about? So let's take them in turns. First, the crowds. Most of us, I imagine, are unlikely to receive an invitation to stay as a guest of the king at his Norfolk home in Sandringham. It's said that King Edward VII's commitment to being a generous host was so great that he had a pair of scales installed at Sandringham House. Guests would weigh themselves in on their arrival and their departure to ensure that they had put on a few pounds during their time as the king's guest. Probably King Edward VII didn't have the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 directly in mind when he was light-heartedly weighing his guests. But it has just the faintest echo of what is going on in this story. Jesus provides more than enough for his guests. 5,000 families, likely, not just 5,000 men. Enough people to fill to capacity Turf Moor, the home of Burnley Football Club. And when they'd all eaten their fill, there were 12 baskets left over, 1 for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So symbolically, enough for everyone all over again. Enough for everyone to take a party bag home with more food in it. This is a story about the generosity of God, the God who gives to us everything that we have and who sees our needs and meets them with more than enough. So one way we might reflect further about this story is to think of all the ways that God blesses us, and of times when God has met our needs. This story invites us to give thanks to God for his provision and to trust God in our needs. Or perhaps we might read this story as a story about the disciples. One of the loveliest features in this story is found right at the start. We often miss it. Taking his disciples along, Jesus slipped quietly away towards the region of Bethsaida. Jesus was seeking some time away from the crowds, a period of rest with just those who were closest to him. But then the crowds followed him after all. How does he respond? He immediately welcomes them, meets their needs, teaching them, healing them. And even when the evening was drawing in and his disciples suggested that he might send them away to find food and lodgings for the night, even then, Jesus, tired though he is, wanting some time away, even then, he's unwilling to let them go. He wants to continue to welcome them and feed them. And he draws his weary disciples, he draws them into this ministry of welcome. You feed them, he says to his disciples. The Greek text emphasizes the word you. You feed them. And on his instruction, the disciples give out the food and collect in the leftovers. Presumably they also travel to Bethsaida to buy the baskets. So another way to read this story is to say that we have been invited along to dinner now for the third time, but this time we've been invited as the waiters or the washers up. If this is a story about the generosity of God, it's also a story which invites us to look to see what Jesus is doing and join in. A story which invites us to be generous ourselves, to give our time, our talents, our treasure to God's work. You feed them, Jesus says to us too. Or thirdly, perhaps this is really a story about Jesus. Immediately before this story, and immediately after it, if you look in Luke's Gospel, you find questions about who Jesus really is. Is he Elijah returned to earth? Or is he Moses? Or is he the Messiah, the expected king who would come to set God's people free from all that oppressed them? And this story provides an answer to that question that comes immediately before and immediately afterwards. It tells us the answer. Jesus is greater than Elijah. Elijah miraculously fed just one family at Zarephath. Jesus is greater than Moses too. Moses miraculously fed the people of Israel in the wilderness, but just one day at a time, with no more left over. Jesus is greater because he is the Messiah, the one who invites us to the heavenly banquet, the feast, which will fill the Lord's house and which will have no end.